Um, so perhaps no one other than hospitals felt the weight of COVID more quickly and more intensely than government did. So somehow they were supposed to keep the trains running, so to speak, while also adhering to the governor's shutdown orders. So figuring out how public bodies were going to meet and do that was a logistical and legal minefield. Panelist Sharon Pandak was part of the advance guard of local government attorneys who worked to develop stopgap measures and more permanent fixtures. Maria Everett, with her FOIA background, had to figure out how to run a critical state agency. And Elliott Robinson was trying to cover Charlottesville and Albemarle County while restricted to his own home. So they are all here to tell you about how these rules came together and how they were applied. So we'll start with Sharon.
Thank you, Megan. I greatly appreciate being invited. I will note to you that your points at the beginning are quite well taken. Localities were faced with a quite unusual situation. We continue to be faced with that. And I would use perhaps at the beginning and at the end, at the risk of invoking the NFL, that Monday morning quarterbacking is always going to be easier in this instance than to sort of look at what we had to do at the time we had to do it. The first issue that was apparent with respect to public meetings was that local government needed to continue to function. And that's not to exclude state government. Maria will talk about that. Federal government even realized that it needed to continue to function. And nobody anticipated a situation in which we would have a pandemic, at least in modern memory, that would last this long. And given that we're still in it, we still don't know where the end is in sight. Finding ourselves behind the times with respect to the laws that are in place. And I recently read an article regarding the 1918 pandemic, and the disadvantage at that point in time was that there weren't all the electronic capabilities that we have today. Maybe perhaps the demands on government were more basic and not perhaps in the meeting context at that point in time. But I want to take you a little bit through how the local government attorneys ended up particularly focusing on this issue and maybe perhaps being a bit in the forefront. Then President Tim Spencer from Roanoke said, we need to try to coordinate or at least help local government attorneys around the state, and we have over 500 members in our association, to be able to provide guidance to their communities at a point in time in which we don't know where the ultimate answers may be, but as best we can and in a way that is as consistent with law, in a way that doesn't get us sued later on once we get out of the pandemic, and in a way that builds confidence in the governing bodies as they are meeting. And so we ended up with what I will call the evolving determination of what is presence and what does presence mean when local governing bodies meet. And when I refer to governing bodies, I want to go beyond just sort of the county, cities, and towns to also regional entities. And I represent several of those in addition to advising some local governments. The bottom line is that we concluded, and I think this is all pretty apparent, so maybe it sounds a little bit like old hat, is that local public entities can meet virtually. And once we concluded that there was a way to do that, and this is in advance of the General Assembly meeting in April, it's in advance of trying to sort out before the Attorney General's opinion what was possible. We thought also we needed to put together some standards and guidelines for those type of public meetings. Virtual meetings pre-COVID, as we know now, were set forth in the statute. They were pretty limited. And what was apparent is that at least to those of us who weren't involved in every intricacy of developing FOIA, was that it never really contemplated a pandemic. It didn't contemplate a disaster that went on for a long period of time. And so, you know, it was sort of like, whoever thought this could last so long? I mean, they're clearly, they covered things like, you know, what happened if we were invaded, which might be short, might be long, but probably preempted most meetings. And we didn't end up in, what do you do when you've got this condition going on out in society that makes people anxious, if not completely precludes them for health reasons from meeting? So the term social distancing really wasn't part of our parlance. That to me was maybe a college term when somebody didn't want to date you. We didn't think about things like, when did we last get a good haircut? Or give somebody a haircut when we're not a cosmetologist. Pre-COVID-19, meeting meant physical presence of at least a quorum of the governing body. And I would describe that as togetherness. Togetherness was important in terms of the concept of public meetings. And FOIA addressed it in that kind of context with exemptions for those people who had physical or other particular issues, but still requiring a quorum unless it was under the one emergency provision, which was to meet in order to address the nature of the emergency in 2.2-3708.2. We quickly found with the pandemic continuing that it wasn't just the nature of the emergency that was a matter that required governing bodies to meet. As we were kind of contemplating all of this and the fact that the pandemic sort of kept staying and staying and staying, we found that we had a presidential declaration of emergency. We had a governor's declaration of emergency and subsequent executive orders to stay away. We had local declarations of emergency. And then we had the Virginia Supreme Court having a declaration of emergency. And as I said, local governing bodies and regional bodies needed to do more than just meet and talk about the emergency. And with the increasing sophistication of and requirements of the feds and the states with respect to dealing with emergencies, we had emergency officials to handle those aspects. Not much perhaps that the local governing body could provide in that regard with respect to expertise. On March 20th, the Attorney General issued an opinion, and that opinion was sought by Delegate Rip Sullivan. A number of us from localities were fortunate enough to have Delegate Sullivan's attention in terms of helping him put together and requesting that opinion. And the Attorney General's opinion, we thought, provided a roadmap of authority for local governing bodies to hold wholly electronic meetings on matters which the locality determines to be essential governmental functions, and obviously with notice and public access. Based on that, a short time later, referring to the Attorney General's opinion, plus all the declarations of emergency, the local government attorneys of Virginia's COVID-19 committee provided a conclusion and some standards that we believe that the Attorney General's opinion supported our work to date with respect to giving guidance to localities and other local and regional public entities on conducting electronic meetings without a quorum, or that is the presence of the governing body assembled. Obviously, we always said, go talk to your own attorney. Our intent was not to preempt that field, but rather to provide that guidance. Following the Attorney General's opinion, which was during the time that the General Assembly was to gear up again to come back and have its veto session, there was a move by a number of entities, localities, to see if the governor would provide some additional legislation in order to further address and further have particularly regional entities feeling secure that they could meet in a virtual capacity. Among those entities was the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. I know, Megan, that your group was active in making those requests. What we got from the veto session was a budget, or actually two budget amendments, but they end up merging, which provided some additional authority. And I'm careful on the term of additional authority because, at least in my view and in some of my colleagues' view, there was sufficient authority to begin with. The Attorney General's opinion, coupled with the Freedom of Information Act and the attendant bases for having an emergency declared. Importantly, with respect to those budget amendments, I wanted to note the comments of Senator Stewart, who I believe also represents a local government, and he's chair of the FOIA Council, stating that we need to adopt this so that local governments can continue to run their counties. I know that local governments and other agencies need the ability to meet and conduct regular business. So we now have a clear understanding, I think, from the state government, from the governor, from that meshes with the local governments and the regional entities' view that we don't know how long this pandemic's going to go on, and we need to conduct our regular business, not just quote unquote special business or emergency business. And that budget amendment, and I won't go through it at length, you all have seen it, allows for, and clearly allows for, state, local, regional regulatory bodies or governing boards to have this, and I'll call it again, additional authority with how they can conduct virtual meetings. The highlights of that authority are that the nature of the emergency makes it impracticable or unsafe for the public body to assemble in one location. The purpose of the meeting is to discuss or transact business statutorily required or necessary to continue operations of the public body and the discharge of its lawful purposes, duties, and responsibilities. And a recording or transcript of the meeting is available on the website in accordance with the timeframes under other sections of the code. There's obviously a notice requirement using the governing body's best available method given the emergency, which is important because not all of our local governing bodies or regional entities have sophisticated electronic communications. That there's an arrangement for public access through electronic means, again, to the extent practicable, using video conferencing technology, that there otherwise is a compliance with 2.23708.2 of the state code under the Freedom of Information Act, and that the nature of the emergency is stated in the fact that the meeting was held by electronic communication and the type in the minutes of the meetings. So, there has been, to my mind, that there's now ample authority, if there was in some people's view before, to meet virtually during this declared emergency to conduct the locality's business. And that includes holding public meetings. Many localities and regional entities have decided to limit their business, although I will say as this pandemic has gone on, the view being that they always conduct important business, but that their range of the business that they are conducting has become broader. I think there has been a very important attempt by the bodies that I'm aware of to provide notice to the public, to give access to the public. In cases where public comment is permitted by or has been held by the entity, public comment not being required part of the agenda, that there have been means provided for that, either in writing or virtually. Public hearings have been held, which do require that the public have an ability to provide input, and that's been done in different ways. Some localities doing social distancing, some doing it virtually, electronically. So not necessarily in consistent ways, but in ways that do provide clearly the ability for the public to provide input. And that has been critical because, as you know, Megan, one of the groups that had concerns were the home builders and the Board of Realtors on how their business with respect to development, rezoning applications could proceed. Quite importantly for those local governments to be able to consider those matters. Budget hearings have been held. That was one of the initial key concerns, is you have to adopt a budget pursuant to certain requirements in the state code. How are you going to do that back in the spring in terms of holding the public hearings? There have been adjustments over time as people have perceived that the virus is receding, to open up some of those meetings so that there may be more hybrid meetings now, with due deference still for those people who are in at-risk categories on members of governing bodies to be able to appear virtually, and in some cases that has ended up not being a quorum, so that the old Freedom of Information Act would not have been particularly helpful. The standards that we sent out, I think, continue to be good in terms of urging localities to acquire and test good technology. There have been some fits and starts, but I think those entities have been dealing with the glitches. We appreciate that as members of the public that have been patient as well. The chairs of those governing bodies have summarized how matters would proceed, and so increasingly we find that governing body members are more facile in actually dealing with the digital natures. I would say that even some people have gone to getting halo lights on their screens in order to make sure that they can be perceived in the appropriate way and in attending virtually those meetings. What I have told all of those I represent, and I think this is consistent with where the local governing bodies have been, and that is that the future of the use of this greater technology, which I think all of us have moved with almost lightning speed to try to understand. But the use of that technology to conduct public business in the Commonwealth really depends on the localities, both individual and their aggregate ability to do so in a transparent, accessible, and consistent manner. I don't see that as doing it perfectly. And I think if people tried to Monday morning quarterback all of this, they might say, well, you could have done this better, you could have done this better. But I think that what we have found is that there have been sincere, positive, and increasingly capable technological attempts and efforts by the local governing bodies and the regional bodies that have gone to virtual meetings to hold those meetings in a way that indicates concern for public health, for the health of their members, and in a way that provides public access. Going forward in the future, the expectations will be higher with respect to the technology, but I believe that we can, I hope that I would say that I'm accurate, that those public bodies that have endeavored to function and give both the continuity of government and the confidence to the public that their governments are equipped and ready and responsive and still in place, all of the things that keep us not only healthy, but also from becoming hysterical about what is going on out there in an uncertain situation, have been successful in providing both the continuity, the public access, and the confidence in public government. So going forward, we will endeavor to stay safe, but we'll also endeavor to stay communicating and giving public access and conducting that business. Be glad to answer any questions later. I think I went a little longer than I was supposed to.
Thank you, Sharon. Maria, you were actually one of the architects of the legislation that sort of gave everybody a platform from which to start on meeting electronically, which was very different from around the country. As I talked to my counterparts in other states, no one had a law in place that already sort of tried to deal with an emergency and how people would meet for that. So with your FOIA background, but then also with your position as chair of the ABC Authority, how did you all approach these new challenges?
Thank you, Megan. It's great to be with everyone, and I couldn't agree with Sharon more about how things rolled out. Well, it's an interesting thing. And first, I just want to say that I have 3 dogs in this room, and at any moment, they're going to get loud and run out the dog door. So I apologize in advance. Luckily, through the beginning of this, they're quiet, but I just wanted to let you know everything is fine. They'll just go flying out the door. I kind of wanted to focus on sort of the practical sides, the logistics of meeting. ABC, we meet through Microsoft Teams. That's the platform we use. And it's been helpful, but there are certain things that an in-person meeting doesn't translate to an electronic or virtual meeting. And so we at the authority have, I guess, a little bit of a benefit in terms of the board for the ABC Authority. We are more like a corporate board. And so the ABC Authority folks, the day-to-day workers, keep it moving. So that's been helpful in certain ways because, yes, we decide certain questions, but, it's a corporate board form. So I just want to kind of give you the how it started and where we are now. We had a meeting in early March, and I showed up and because of FOIA, and Sharon's right. I mean, we didn't anticipate a pandemic. I wish somebody had said that word. We were like catastrophe, calamity, wish we'd explored further words. But, there was no provision in FOIA for us to meet except the limitation to address the emergency. And so I had suggested, well, let's go ahead and just have a regular FOIA e-meeting with 2 members participating remotely so that we could do all the business that we were required to do. I showed up about an hour earlier with a huge thing of Lysol wipes, and I wiped down everything in the boardroom. I removed every chair that wasn't necessary and socially distanced the 3 people on the board versus staff. And it was kind of sort of hilarious. I felt part of like the janitorial staff, but it was important that people that came felt confident that we were clean. And that meeting went, just fine under the law. As I said, my concern was more the logistics of how things don't translate as well in a virtual world. And like the length of meetings seems to just go on and on. And from my experience at the General Assembly, a 2 or 3 hour meeting is about it. I mean, 5-hour meetings just virtually are, horrendous. So we need to, and for people participating, it just can't go on and on and on like that. And then like I said, the display of handouts when people are making reports or sharing their screen, you have to be cognizant of, for board members as well as the public tuning in, that it doesn't translate the same way. So the font has to be bigger. You can't use spreadsheets as effectively because it crams the documents up. And we had a number of technical problems. We have 2 members of our board that are always, having technical issues from home. One always appears sideways to the screen, but his audio was fine. But then once he got straight up and down, his audio went out. So go figure. And another one of our members the audio has been a problem. The other thing I wanted to ensure was, public participation. We traditionally don't have a lot of public in the room, but wanted to make sure that, there was a platform for them to participate, as well as, giving feedback on how the meeting went and the quality of that procedure. The only question I had, as you indicated, I helped with trying to get something into the budget that seemed the fastest solution so that people could go. Because my first thing, I know, sacrilege, I was like, well, for continuity of government, under the circumstances, I'd violate FOIA first, But then we got something in the budget, which was good. The only trouble I have is, what the heck is a transcript? And I know Alan Gernhardt and I have talked about what is a transcript. We're able to record the entire thing, but that's not necessarily helpful if the public wants to go back and listen to a particular part or a particular discussion, it doesn't navigate well for that. So my point of view, as I said, is sort of, how do we ensure meaningful public participation, public access, and get a feed on the quality of what they're hearing, and how do people after the fact see it and navigate through it. That's really all. I was prepared to answer some questions. I want to leave more time for Elliott, but I'm happy to, if there are any questions, to answer that. But at ABC, like I said, I think we're rolling on pretty well. And I think everybody who visits regularly their ABC store gets, delivery, because we're dumping a whole lot of money into the budget for everybody. So that's a good thing.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Maria. Elliott, you have been on the opposite end of the camera from Sharon and Maria. You've been a consumer of meetings and a requester of records. So what have you seen the localities in your coverage area at Charlottesville Tomorrow respond?
Thanks, Megan. Yeah, it has been interesting for us because with the ordinances coming out for continuity of government, we had a range of responses between Charlottesville and Albemarle County. In Charlottesville itself, they continue to fulfill FOIA requests as usual. They had some other things that were going on at the time. They've been the bombardment of requests since 2017 that were still happening. And then also there was a video for the arrest of a homeless person on our downtown pedestrian mall, which sparked another conversation. So they were still getting requests, and they were more or less getting things sent back out in a timely fashion. But in Albemarle County and its continuity of governance ordinance, it had included language that said that it was no longer obligated to respond to the 5-day deadline to respond. So in early June, when our education reporter had contacted the school board to ask them about their plans for reopening, and the deadline came and went, and we hadn't heard anything from them. And then wondering exactly what happened, we had sent another email to the county attorney, and he had responded about the ordinance and how they had said that they no longer had to respond within 5 working days. So that was in July. So when we heard of that, we were just thinking that that didn't sound exactly right. So we looked into what the state government had outlined as the pandemic had started unfolding, and we saw that what seemed to be a contradiction of laws that needed to be addressed. And so we countered with that to the Albemarle County, and then we had also contacted the University of Virginia's First Amendment clinic just to see, it's like, well, what exactly are we looking at here? Are we looking at this wrong, or has Albemarle interpreted something wrong, just to get things cleared out? And the First Amendment clinic went on to send a letter to Albemarle County saying that their ordinance was overbroad by saying that it wasn't bound by any deadlines and that wasn't supported by state law. So in late August, after the letter went out, we did receive the records from Albemarle County, and but they reiterated that the reason that there was a delay was that their provision was to protect employees in situations where it would have been impossible or unsafe to search for paper records in the administration buildings, but we were asking for things that were purely electronic. And part of our argument was that with them not having any deadline whatsoever, there was no guarantee that any sort of public records request would be fulfilled. So at this moment, their ordinance still stands. Next week, they have a meeting where they're going to tweak the language of it a bit. So it's going to say that they may extend deadlines to the earliest date practical. But we're thinking that still is a bit broad, and we have also contacted our local delegate, Sally Hudson, and she just informed us this week that the Albemarle County's current ordinance has been sent up to State Attorney General Mark Herring's office to get his opinion on exactly what their ordinance should say as far as FOIA in this time of COVID.
Thanks, Elliott. Can you also, I mean, I don't want to cut off any future conversation about what you just said, but also can you give us a comparison about whether there were differences between the way Charlottesville and Albemarle County handled their meetings? There might not be. I was just curious.
The meetings themselves have been somewhat consistent. Both the city and the county record their meetings and broadcast them live. In Charlottesville, they've always had them on their local television station. They've continued to do that. And also they've set up a Zoom format so people can phone in or log in on Zoom and just wait for their turn to do public hearings. And Albemarle County has their own internal system on their website. So there still is a public interaction in that way.
If I might maybe comment a moment in response to a couple of things that Elliott said. I don't know whether I'm on.
You should be unmuted now, Sharon.
Okay, thank you. Elliott, I have a couple of clients that have quite active reporters, perhaps like you, that are dealing with them frequently. And I guess a couple of points I would make, sort of maybe along the vein of Maria's, what did we discover that we didn't really know? Some the remote access that some officials have had to their databases has been varying. I think a lot of us get sucked into thinking technology is everything now, and I did too, but I know I have one client where I have to go through a couple of points now, and I actually can get into their database. They're not a Virginia locality, but I did not have access remotely, and so I think that has been true of some localities in Virginia where the people who may have been the people who had to respond to requests for documents couldn't get immediate access because of the closure of buildings. And then there have been, as you know, unfortunately, there have been some cybersecurity attacks that go on out there. So there's a nervousness about remote access in some cases. I think over time there has been much improvement in that regard. My clients who have had very active reporters dealing with them, I can say I have not heard that there are concerns with the responsiveness. We have been able, I know early on we had some difficulty getting to some records, and the reporters who had asked for it were quite patient when we said, gee, can you give us some more time, because we just can't get to them. Or these particular records are not digitized. You know, we can't get to those for a while. So hopefully those things that you consider negative experiences might be worked out. Similarly, I would note that we had there from time to time are glitches on the platforms with respect to the meetings, and my clients have been careful to provide both phone numbers to call so that people can get access if they for some reason feel like they're getting locked out. And I've had some clients that use multiple platforms, so they might be using GoToMeeting and YouTube, so that there's a backup platform. So I mentioned those couple things because I think those are things that local governing bodies have learned or begun to learn over time, that have brought what may have been an over expectation because of what we think we know otherwise about the technology around generally up to speed.
Yeah, with us, it was just our County, just the blanket response of they don't need to respond. And for us, it's as if there was that explanation of we can't access this at this moment, or it's impossible for us to do it right now. But we can if you give us some more time. It would have just changed the tenor of things. It was just the absolute, we aren't doing this, or this says that we're exempt from having to respond to this at all.
Yeah, I just want to chime in on that because, you know, I'm sure Alan preaches it now. And when I was in the FOIA council, at the FOIA council, you know, communication is key. And if you just explain to people, you know, and work with them, you get a much better result than sort of that, we're the government, we're not answering you. That's just never a good answer, because if you just explain, I think everybody understands we're in a different time and space, and that there are logistic problems and things of people not in the office. But again, working with people for the positive outcome is much better than what you've experienced, Elliott.
Yeah, so that was part of the reason that we had gone as far as we did, is that we feel like it's a duty to the citizens that there is a better explanation of why you can't do those things instead of just a flat out no.
Can I mention another thing? And maybe I appreciate particularly the press's and view that we need to have information quickly, because people are looking to you for information. I think some localities over time have, as they've been able to sort of maybe grapple with this whole pandemic better, have been more in the forefront of sort of saying, here are things going on, so that they're anticipating the types of things, Elliott, that you might write about. The separate thing I do want to mention and is that I worry about on-the-fly legislation, and that's perhaps not fair, Maria, to talk about the budget amendment that way, or any amendments that might come out of this special session of the General Assembly. I noticed, I think earlier, Alan Gernhardt's name on the list of people participating in this conference. I do think there is merit for a forum such as the FOIA Council to consider in a greater way how things have gone, what changes need to be made, and to make recommendations going into the future. I can't say, Maria, and you'll correct me, that I've always agreed with the FOIA Council, but I think that's a really good place to have those kind of discussions, because I will tell you that if we were in the midst of the bubonic plague, not the current pandemic, or we were under a national attack, that trying to sort through the Freedom of Information Act and clearly understand what you can do right now, would be very difficult. And if there is an emergency, it seems to me that we need to be able to sort of more clearly sort this out. And the reason why I think Tim Spencer at the LGA as president formed our committee in part was to try to give that guidance, because it was not all that clear. And going forward, now that we've had this experience with a new type of emergency, I think there is merit in sort of not trying to do Band-Aid approaches, but to come up with something that's a little clearer and compact and packaged. You know, trying to get the nuance of what is continuity of government versus what is important to government versus what are transactions of government. I mean, it seems to me that there's some attempt at wordsmithing there, that I at a bottom line say, when, you know, my governing bodies need to just take action, it's, you got to take action, therefore it's important. And somebody has just flipped up that there's a subcommittee that's been developed on this. That's great, but I think it would be really useful for the FOIA Advisory Council to both come up with some proposed clearer legislation, recognizing that we may have other emergencies in the future. I hope it's not the meteor that somebody keeps talking about, and then to allow governing bodies to have some time to provide input on those. And so that the practical implications, I mean, one of the issues you pointed out, Marie, on transcripts is an issue. You know, requiring a posting of the video of the meeting on some websites doesn't work for some localities. So I think people understand, and elected representatives and appointed representatives understand that the public has a need to know and that they should know, but we need to work through these glitches, and we need to make it easier to pull out if there's an emergency. That's my soapbox.
Well, no, Sharon, I couldn't agree with you more. And, you know, the budget amendment seemed to be the fastest way to address it, so that government, because I agree with you, localities had a little more tools in the tool belt that they could use in Title 15.2, but state bodies did not. And I agree, it was a Band-Aid approach. It was pretty good at the time, but I couldn't agree more that the FOIA Council has historically been the forum to bring everybody together. And I think in a virtual world that still can happen, to hammer out the how it exactly looks like. And yeah, something that goes on and on, not, you know, a snowstorm, or, you know, the streets buckle because of an earthquake, or, you know, those, I remember those were the discussions we had when we formulated, where there's been a state of emergency declared, and to limit it that you could only talk about, nobody was thinking about continuity of government because it appeared to be short term. But I couldn't agree more that the FOIA Council really is the forum to get a more permanent solution. But knowing that the budget language trumps every other statute seemed like the best way to get it done. So I understand they do have a subcommittee at the FOIA Council.
Yes, they do. And Elliott, so we heard from Mel and Ned Oliver in the first panel about covering the General Assembly in these virtual meeting times. Can you talk a little bit about challenges or how your reporting has changed when you don't have the physical access to both the the lawmakers and the members of the public who show up to speak at meetings?
That has been a bit of a challenge for Charlottesville, for example. Their city council meetings are very lively and interactive, to put it lightly. So it was a lot easier during the breaks to talk to the individual council members about what just took place, or members of the audiences, to get better feedback. And now in this virtual format, where it has somewhat run smoothly because they had been experimenting with a virtual component before the pandemic started, it's kind of it leaves a void with some of the glitches, and then with the removal of people being in a physical space, because you can't just easily grab someone for elaboration or send a quick message. And it has drawn out the meetings a bit more, and it isn't just from the technical issues, because part of their continuity ordinances, they deferred a lot of things earlier on in the pandemic, and now it's gotten to that point where there are things like, well, this can't wait any longer, we need to talk about it. And then it turns into, well, we'll just talk about it today. And now we've had situations where the meetings go into the wee hours of the morning, and we've had public hearings where really no one's spoken, because you've reached that point where no one is around anymore to make those comments. So I think that's the one problem we're dealing with now, is trying to rein these meetings back in, so we get more of that participation that we had before. It's like we had at this week's city council meeting, they were talking about a litany of honorary street renamings, and a lot of it was related to a lot of the political unrest in the past few months. And there was just a severe drop off in participation. And one of the commenters said was that people, they're dealing with their kids going back to school, they're dealing with their jobs, they're operating virtually, and no one has the bandwidth to power through an 8-hour virtual meeting to participate in the government the way they would like to.
As a stopgap, maybe something that that governing bodies could do is sort of have, set aside, I don't know, not to make the meetings much longer, but set aside to receive some kind of input from people, sort of in the same format we have sort of the chat function here, where people could ask questions that they could just spend a little time addressing it. Because I think encouraging that kind of public participation when people have, and there's a million issues that related to the agenda, what's being talked about, instead of using it as a platform for, talking about something that is not being dealt with the public body at the same time, because there's another way to handle that. But maybe, setting aside some small amount of time to get questions and actually respond to them. And it may be the staff versus the board members, but I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head where you could, you know, how we can make this more user-friendly for the public, because I think that's the one thing we all share in common, is that public access is paramount. It's just, how do you do it for
Yeah, I agree.
in a meaningful way?
What I found interesting too, and any of you all can speak to this, is when the Commonwealth moved into phase 3, we started seeing this transition from everybody doing all virtual to now there are these hybrids, and now some people have moved into in person, but then are still trying to observe social distancing. So I recently, a state board that said they were going to hold an in-person meeting, and they were only going to allow 9 people to be present, and they weren't going to allow any virtual access. So I've been seeing, that was actually the third such instance this week that I've heard about from both state and local. And so I'm wondering so where we're going with this intermediate period. If you have any thoughts on that.
I do think, my view is it's a challenging period. I don't want to sound like that I'm exclusionary, but I would say it's almost better to have everybody virtual and that it is to have half and half in terms of how I view the experience, but that's just me outside as an attorney watching it. I do think there's a dynamic about having everybody in person that has a certain, that gives a focus to it. I also believe that having everybody virtual and perceiving it, there's a focus to it, but half in, half out to me is harder for the group to have a dynamic. One of the things that one of my regional entities did in terms, and they were expecting a lot of public comment, but there was no public hearing scheduled, was to ask for comment to be made in writing in advance. And they put a very high cap on what could be submitted, and some of the comments were quite long. They were provided in advance to the members of the governing body because it was thought important in order to provide information, let people think about it, not just what you frequently have in public meetings is people come up and comment, and there's really not the focus time. Having an engagement back and forth with those who are the public, I will call it, and the elected body, I will say may work if there's just 1 or 2 people, but as a pattern can really cause those meetings to become quite long. And I think what I would suggest to my governing bodies that might contemplate that is they might hold something like a town hall instead of having that as part of their regular meeting, as a way of having that dialogue, because for those who are not participating in it but are interested in what is on the agenda for that meeting, it could make it very, very long.
Okay, well, we're getting close to our 12:30 next panel, but we still have time for some final comments or concerns. Maria or Elliott, and then come back to you, Sharon. Or not.
I would just say this is, go ahead, Marie.
No, go ahead, Sharon. It's all right.
I think
I'm still formulating.
It's been a huge learning experience for everybody. And it's one in which there's also a great deal of fear out there about, what happens with physical contact. Is somebody going to get COVID next? It's, so you have that on top of the learning curve that maybe creates anxiety. Then there's the anxiety to have knowledge, which I think Elliott's and his colleague reporters are trying to address. So I really encourage that the citizenry, the residents, the businesses, to give their governing body members ideas on what might help them better, or to provide some feedback, because I would hope there'd be some responsiveness there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more because, you know, I always talked about the responsibility of citizenship. And so feedback is paramount. And that was sort of one of my things is more to the practical logistical side of the meetings is that, is there adequate notice? And I think there is, just speaking from the ABC model, but how do people actually in a virtual world have opportunity? Given my background, I always have public comment, but you know, it's usually 2 or 3 people. But as long as I think everybody that's involved in this conference is committed to public access and solving problems, and how we do that. And, you know, again, I look to the format of the FOIA Council to pull all those viewpoints in, and, you know, we can all be creative about how we do stuff without making meetings. Well, I know local government meetings can be long anyway, and I've heard, you know, Elliott, a lot of people, it's like by the time they finish, it's like 2 o'clock in the morning and who's still there. And I don't think that's by design. But I'm certainly, you know, having been a lawyer for the General Assembly, it's like 2 hours, 3 hours max for a state board. I mean, especially a state board that's not really running the show, is kind of important. But how we can, yeah, it's a very strange time and you want to be, but if the goal is public access, which I think it is, and I think my last editorials when I became the chairman of the ABC Authority, which was kind of interesting anyway, but my colleagues in the Local Government Attorneys Association, I got bombarded with questions like, so, Maria, how do you like open meetings law now that you're chairman of a board? And I was snarky. I said, it's not a problem. It's a state of mind, you know? So that's my last one to my local government peeps. You know, and I think we all share that. That's why we're here today.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add, it's like, I see that a lot of these ordinances and rules have happened on the fly because it became such an emergency situation, and there was originally the idea that this wasn't going to last for very long, and I think some of the problems just arose that the expected 2 weeks back in March turned into, what is it, 6 months now, 7 months, and this, a lot of that had been the leftover of, we needed to revisit what was passed back then and think of some different avenues to make some of these processes function now that we know that this is definitely how things are going to operate.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you all so much, Sharon, Maria, Elliott, for sharing an hour with us and giving us some insight and to your experience and to your knowledge. And I'll take you off of being on the spotlight here.